back, everybody, to the Healthsucks channel. Remember, knowledge is power and health sucks, so let's talk about it. If you guys joined us last week, then you do remember, or you know, that we went over the abdominal aorta and the descending branches of the aorta to see that it supplies a lot of the organs in your GI system. But today I'm going to take that a step further. Rather than talking about blood supply and branches, I'm going to talk about a specific system that involves some of these organs we talked about. So today we're going to be talking about the Renin Angiotensin Aldosterone System. So this system is going to involve these organs that you see here: the liver, the lungs, the kidneys, the adrenal medulla, and the cortex, and also the pituitary gland. I'll talk in more detail on step number 2, or step number 1, sorry, and then step number 2, we're going to go into the steps of the system and what's being created in order to fluctuate your blood pressure. So if you guys are like dehydrated or you have not enough sodium, this is the system that reacts to that and inevitably causes you to increase your blood pressure or decrease if, let's say, you had too much sodium in your bloodstream. So let's not wait anymore. Let's get right into it, guys. Let's start talking about the organs. And then once I do that, guys, after I'm done, we're going to talk about some other important organs and some of the key features that you need to be aware of. All right, guys, so let's start with this next step here and begin with the kidneys and work our way up. So we know the kidneys has 2 different distinct features, which is the kidney itself and the adrenal glands that sits on top of it. So even though the kidney is mainly an excretory organ, it also has endocrine function via the adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal gland itself has 2 different parts to it. You have the cortex on the outside and the medulla on the inside. So let's start with the cortex. Let's start with the GFR on the cortex. So the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and then the zona reticularis. So for the first one, you have glomerulosa. Another way to remember this is salty, sweet sex. So salty means what? Sodium, aldosterone. So aldosterone is going to be secreted in the zona glomerulosa. And then you have the next one, which is sweet. That's fasciculata, and that's going to be cholesterol. And then in the last part, you have the reticularis, which is sex. So for sex, you have what? Your androgens or your sex hormones, meaning testosterone or estrogen. So that's it for the cortex. Now the next part is going to be the medulla. In the medulla, you have sympathetic. So this is where you get kind of excitatory function via endocrine. So this is sympathetic function via norepinephrine and epinephrine in the medulla. Now I'm going to get back to the cortex later, but I want to focus more on the kidney itself right now and the main features of the kidney. So what is the kidney's responsibility? Well, there's many of it. Mainly, like I said, it's excretory. So it's going to excrete waste products. It's going to balance your acid-base complexes, your electrolytes, and then also its most important function is, of course, blood pressure control. So how does it do that? Well, we know the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron, and there's over 1 million nephrons in a kidney, although they are going to lack the ability to regenerate if damaged. Just something important to know, the glomerulus filtrates at a rate of 120 milliliters per minute. So let's continue on down through the Bowman's capsule, which holds the glomerulus inside of it, and then you have the Bowman's space where things are going to be absorbed through. So as we work our way down, we get to the proximal convoluted tubule in the nephron, and the PCT its responsibility is mainly to absorb your big proteins or your aminos and things like sugars. Glucose should be definitely absorbed 100% here. And if not, you may run into problems. So like, for example, if you're a diabetic, you may be aware that there's a threshold of sugar that can be within your blood. So if you have over 180 milliliters or milligram per deciliter, then you've reached that threshold and now glucose will excrete through the urine, and that will cause a lot of issues. You don't want that. So let's continue. The main things to be absorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule are things like sodium, potassium, and calcium, about 60 to 70%. So we have to save some room to let a little bit more out or in later on as we work through. So let's keep going. So from the proximal, you go down to the loop of Henle. We have a descending portion and an ascending portion of the loop of Henle. You have a thin descending, which is going to be responsible for allowing water to be excreted or reabsorbed in the kidney in order to further concentrate urea. So the ascending portion of it then is going to not allow for water to be excreted, and in fact is going to allow for the dilution of the urine, so that it's not as toxic to the body as it's excreted through your ureters. So now that we know that, so there's some other things I didn't mention. Now, if water is being reabsorbed in this area, the descending, I also didn't mention in the proximal is about 50% water reabsorption as well. Now, as we continue through to get through the distal convoluted tubule, this is where other things are going to be reabsorbed or excreted again. So for example, as we worked our way up the ascending loop of Henle, things like chloride or sodium were trapped inside in order to further concentrate or dilute the urine. But once it gets up here, it kind of gives it another taste and says, all right, well, do we need more sodium to be excreted, or do we need more sodium to be absorbed, or do we need to excrete possibly potassium on the outside? And that's where that would happen. Now the collecting duct is the end, and this is where you would have two nephrons, two glomerular capsules on either side of the nephron coming together to reach the end product of the ureter. So they come together to form the collecting duct. Now, why is the collecting duct important? Well, this is where your pituitary gland is going to have an effect on this. So for example, later on, if let's say you had too much sodium, we're going to talk about how this R.A.A.S is going to affect this. So if you had too much sodium, ADH, which is released by the posterior pituitary gland via the hypothalamus, is going to act on this part, telling you to do what? What is anti-diuretic hormone standing for? Well, it's telling you you don't want to pee. So it says reabsorb all of that water so that you can further dilute your urine. All right, guys, so we're on to the liver now. Now that we talked about the kidneys, let's talk about the important features of the liver. So for those of you who did not know, the liver is in fact the largest organ inside of your body. Roughly 3 to 4 pounds or 2.5% of your body weight. Now that's not comparative to the skin, which is the largest organ on the outside of your body, that's on your body. So anyway, moving on. The liver is separated into two lobes. You got your left lobe and your right lobe. And then you have what's behind it, which is the gallbladder. And that's going to be very important when we talk about bile and things like that. But for now, we're going to keep it simple. So I'm going to talk about some roles. We know that the functional unit of a kidney, is the nephron. But of the liver is going to be the lobule or the hepatocytes inside the lobules. Now, don't get that confused with your Kupffer cells. The Kupffer cells are important for immune function. These are basically going to be your macrophages of your liver and help with immune things. So the next step is to know the roles. The roles are going to be very important for the liver. It's a very, very important organ, which is probably why it's one of the biggest. So not only does it create its own carbs if it needs to, it can also create or store proteins and lipids as well. And then you have the storage of glycogen. You have the storage of vitamin A, vitamin B12, which we know is absorbed where? In the distal ileum. And then we get on to conjugates bilirubin. Now, I know this might be a little confusing for some, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because there is a whole other pathway where you have to know where unconjugated bilirubin, which is basically just old red blood cells coming from the spleen, and how it turns from unconjugated to conjugated in the liver. And then it has two places it can go from there. It's either going to go out through your urine via urobilinogen or urobilin, or I can't remember quite exactly. And then it'll either go out the other side, which through your GI system, via stercobilin or bilinogen. Okay, so now that we have the basics down, let's talk about a little bit more. Of course, we know that the liver detoxifies your blood or any hormones it doesn't want in there, or let's say you took a drug. That's why you often have, with some recreational use of drugs, a first pass effect, because the liver sometimes does not recognize a toxin the first time around. Therefore, it does not interact with it, it just excretes it. All right, so as we continue, we have the production of antibodies, and then we also have clotting factors that are very important for the liver. So we know clotting is important if you have suffer from some kind of injury, whether it's a cut or anything like that. And clotting factors 2, 7, 9, and 10 are going to be important for the liver. 2, 7, 9, and 10 are important for the liver, guys. All right, moving on. So what else do we have to talk about with the liver? That pretty much is it, except for the fact that now this liver is going to have a part in the Renin Angiotensin Aldosterone System via angiotensin and angiotensinogen, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. But for now, let's move on to the lungs and then talk a little bit about pituitary gland before we put this all together. Later.